Jimmy Fallon speechless. When Eddie Murphy suddenly falls silent after spotting this face, Eddie Murphy stopped laughing. That is the sentence. That is the thing that made 300 people go completely still. Not a pause between jokes, not a breath before the next one. Eddie Murphy, who had been making rooms erupt since before most people in that audience were born, stopped laughing the moment Jimmy turned the photograph over and didn't start again. He looked at the photograph the way a person looks at something they thought they had lost for good. Jimmy Fallon said nothing. He just held it there. The whole room held its breath with him. It was a Monday in September. The Tonight Show had its full audience, every seat filled, the lights warm and high, the anticipation of a crowd that had dressed for this and arrived early. Eddie Murphy was there for the first time in years, and the room knew it. And the energy was the particular energy of a reunion between a crowd and someone they had missed without fully knowing how much. He came out unhurried, confident, that smile arriving a beat before the rest of him. The smile of a man who has known for 50 years exactly what effect he has on a room. The interview was extraordinary from the opening minute. Jimmy couldn't get a question in. Murphy had a story about his childhood in Brooklyn that had the whole room convulsing. Another one about a conversation with his children that was even better. He was operating at something close to full power. Everything was electric. Everything was alive. The segment producer later said she had worked in late-night television for 20 years and had never once seen Eddie Murphy lose the room. She just hadn't considered, until that Monday, that what she meant was she'd never seen the room lose him. Then, Jimmy reached under his desk. He brought out a photograph. Not framed. Not mounted. Printed on the thick paper of a time before digital, the edges slightly soft, the color a little warm the way old photographs go warm when they have been handled by the same hands for a long time. Not posed. Not staged. Not a publicity shot. Just a face. Looking directly at the camera. Smiling, Jimmy turned it over and held it toward Eddie Murphy. Murphy leaned forward in the chair. His eyes found the photograph, and he went absolutely still. His hands, the hands of a performer who thinks with his body, dropped to his knees and stopped. His jaw tightened. His face did something that was not a performance, not a comedic take, not any expression anyone in that room had seen on that face before. Something private. Something old, Jimmy said, very quietly, Eddie. Murphy didn't answer. The entire studio froze. Wrong assumptions ran through that audience like cold through a room when a door opens. Was the photograph bad news? Was this an ambush? He was 63 years old, and he had gone somewhere inside himself that no one in that audience could follow. 300 people held their breath. Eddie Murphy reached out and took the photograph from Jimmy's hand. He held it with both hands. He looked at it for a long time. A long time. His voice barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone, he said, "Where did you find him?" Not a question. The statement of a man who has spent a very long time not knowing the answer. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1973. Eddie Murphy wasn't always Eddie Murphy, icon and legend. In the summer of 1973, Eddie Murphy was 12 years old and living in Roosevelt, Long Island, a small suburb east of the city. The schools decent. The kind of community that had pulled itself into something that held together. His parents had divorced when he was 3. His mother had fallen ill. He and his brother Charlie had lived for a time with a foster family. He had come back home to Roosevelt by 1973, but those years had left something in him. Not bitterness, but a way of reading rooms. If you made people laugh, they relaxed. And if they relaxed, They stopped looking at you too hard. By 12, he was doing it constantly. In the schoolyard, at the dinner table, in the back of every classroom. James Brown, Bill Cosby, Archie Bunker. He did them in the lunch line, while waiting for the bus, compulsively, the way you practice something when you know on some wordless level that it is the thing. There was a man in the neighborhood named Walter Gibbs. Walter was 58 years old. He had worked 31 years as a machinist in Hempstead, a large, quiet man who had played semi-professional baseball in his 20s and still carried himself with that posture. He lived 2 houses down from the Murphys and spent most summer evenings on a covered porch reading or listening to a portable radio. He had seen Eddie perform once before the summer of 1973 at a neighborhood block party where the kid had done 20 minutes of material in front of folding chairs and a picnic table. Walter had not laughed the way the crowd laughed. He had watched. After the block party, he found Eddie at the drinks table and said, "How long have you been doing that?" Eddie said, "I don't know." "Always," Walter said. "You don't do it because it's funny. You do it because it's true. That's different from what most people do." Eddie Murphy was 11 years old. He looked at this man he did not know and understood, without being able to say why, that he had just been seen by someone who was actually looking. They began to talk at the fence on the porch in the evenings when Eddie was sent outside while his mother rested. Walter asked questions not to be entertained, but because he genuinely wanted to understand the thing he had seen at the block party. Eddie told him things he had not told anyone. About the foster family. About watching his mother be ill. About how the impressions had started as a way of making the foster kids laugh when the house was too quiet. And how being someone else for 30 seconds was a way of surviving being himself. Walter listened and said very little. When he did speak, it was usually one sentence that Eddie would turn over for days. Once, on an August evening in 1973, he said, "The best comedians are the ones who are also watching. Don't ever stop watching." Eddie came to understand that Walter was the only adult who had ever treated the thing he did as serious, not a party trick, not a way of staying out of trouble, but something worth thinking about carefully. In November of 1973, Walter Gibbs was diagnosed with lung cancer. He had been coughing since the spring. Stage 4. 6 months, maybe less. He did not stop sitting on the porch. He did not stop asking questions. When Eddie came to the fence, he talked with him the same way he always had, as though nothing had changed. In January of 1974, on a Thursday evening Eddie Murphy has never forgotten, Walter called him onto the porch and asked him to sit down. He had a camera, boxy, film, sitting in a case beside his chair. He asked a neighbor on the sidewalk to take a photograph of the two of them. Just one. Then he said, "I want you to have something when I'm gone, not of me, but of the way it feels right now to be sure of something before the rest of the world is caught up." Walter Gibbs died in April of 1974. He was 58 years old. Eddie Murphy was 12. He stood at the service in Roosevelt and did not perform, did not do an impression, did not make anyone laugh. He let it be what it was. He had not known what happened to the photograph. He thought about Walter Gibbs before every major performance for 50 years. Before his first night at the comic strip, before Snill, before Delirious. Every time he stood in the dark before a room he was about to take apart, he thought about the man on the porch who had said the thing he was doing was serious. He had looked for the photograph once, 20 years ago, clearing out a storage unit in California. It wasn't there. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Walter's daughter, a woman named Patricia, had kept the photograph in the same box as her father's baseball gloves. She had found it 2 years ago while settling the last of his affairs and had been trying to figure out what to do with it ever since. She had seen Eddie Murphy on a talk show and understood. Patricia had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer in March. Stage 4, 6 months, maybe less. The letter to The Tonight Show was the last of the letters she needed to write. She did not ask to meet Eddie Murphy. She asked only that the photograph reach him. She wrote, "My father talked about that boy on the porch for the rest of his life. I think he should know." Eddie Murphy's assistant called Patricia within 24 hours of the letter arriving. The arrangement was made quietly. Tonight Show staff were told only that a specific guest would be present. They were not told what was in the envelope. Patricia was in row 2, left aisle, wearing a blue coat. She had come with her son Marcus. She believed she was there to watch a taping. She did not know the photograph had been given to Jimmy that morning, and she did not know that Eddie Murphy had been alone in his dressing room for 20 minutes before the show with the photograph in his hands. Murphy had asked for only one thing, that Patricia not be told what was coming. He wanted her to feel like a person, not a moment. Behind the scenes, Eddie Murphy had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He had told the segment producer 2 hours before taping, no run of show, no cue, no segment plan. Whatever happened was going to happen the way real things happen, without staging, without a prepared word, in front of everyone. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Murphy said, "Where did you find him?" And the room was silent. Jimmy looked at him. Then he looked out at the audience. He looked at row 2. Murphy followed his eyes. A woman in a blue coat was sitting very still in the second row, left aisle. Small, not young. The particular stillness of someone rationing their energy because they know exactly how much they have left and what they need it for. Eddie Murphy looked at her. Then he looked at Jimmy. Jimmy gave the smallest nod. Murphy sat back in his chair for one moment. Just one. Then he stood up. He didn't speak. He stepped down off the platform, walked past the first row, and stopped at the end of the second row aisle. Jimmy Fallon stood up. He walked to the edge of the stage and sat down on it, both hands over his mouth. "Folks," he said, the words barely holding together, "I think we need to let this happen." In the control room, the director did not call for a cut to commercial. The cameraman on the floor did not move. Questlove set his drumsticks down on the snare and stood up. Patricia looked up from the second row. Her son Marcus had his arm around her. She looked at the man standing at the end of her row and understood, not because of who he was, but because of what was in his face, that what was happening was real. She stood. Marcus helped her. Eddie Murphy walked to her. "Your father talked to me," he said. His voice was low and steady, the voice of someone who has had 50 years to learn how to hold hard things. I was 12. He was the first grown man who ever took what I was doing seriously. Patricia nodded. Her eyes were full. "He came to a block party," Murphy said. "He didn't laugh like everyone else. He just watched. He stopped. Nobody watched. Everybody laughed, but nobody watched. That was him," Patricia said. Her voice broke on the last word. That was exactly him. He held out the photograph. She looked at it. Her father's face, young, alive, beside a 12-year-old boy who had no idea yet what he was going to become. "He should have this back," Murphy said. "He left it for you." "I know." He placed it in her hands and closed both of his hands over hers. "Then you keep it for both of us." The standing ovation started from somewhere near the back. One person, then a row. Then the whole room rising like a tide from every direction at once, until every person in that studio was on their feet, and Eddie Murphy was standing in the second row aisle with both of Patricia Gibbs's hands in his, and the photograph was between them. And the room was so full of something that the walls of the studio could barely contain it. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 7 weeks later, on a Wednesday afternoon in October, Patricia Gibbs died at home in Roosevelt, Long Island, the same town where her father had sat on a covered porch and talked to a 12-year-old boy who was going to be something. Long before the world had any idea. She was 61 years old. The photograph was placed in a simple frame by Marcus and hung in the house in Roosevelt where Walter Gibbs had lived. Not a landmark, just a house on a street in a suburb east of the city, where a large, quiet man had once watched a kid in the yard next door, the way you watch something you want to understand completely. Eddie Murphy did not speak at the service. He sat in the third row and stayed until the room was empty. Marcus said that on the way out, Murphy stopped at the threshold and stood there a moment. Then he said he was still watching. That whole time. He never stopped. The best comedians are the ones who are also watching, and sometimes the person watching you is the reason you never stop.